Hi, my name is Fee and I'm the Scotland coordinator for Just Love, and we're going to be focusing in on the next wee while on team dynamics. Asking the question kind of what does it look like to work well together over the next year in your committees, and how can we recognise difference and have a bit more self-awareness. So that's the kind of premise of what we're going to be focusing in on. We're going to do that firstly with talking a little bit about personality types. So we've asked you to take a sort of little test online, a 16 personality type test, and we're going to focus in on that, and then we'll have a bit of a break where you can chat in your committees, and then we'll come back to some maybe broader team stuff, and that will be based around a guy called Patrick Lencioni, and this thing called the 5 dysfunctions of a team that he's come up with, some of his work, and touching on how that impacts you as a whole. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing, guiding you through some of that. Before I say anything else though, I want to say that firstly, team dynamics is one of my favourite sessions, because I think when we do this well, it can set a really good foundation for the entire year and how we pursue justice. But also, I want to say that we're all a work in progress when it comes to this sort of thing. So don't be worried about not having it all together, perhaps, or feeling as though there's things you need to work on. I'm a work in progress. I actually think we're all works in progress when it comes to working out how we function best personally, but also within a team. But why should we care about team dynamics, I hear you ask? I think there are 2 particular reasons that we think it's really important to care about this. The first is that Jesus cared about this. I think he was the ultimate team dynamics expert. He managed a team of 12 disciples very well. And while that's not what we want to focus in on when we focus in on the Gospels and his stories, I think that's something that's a bit of we don't think about very much, is that he was really good at dealing with other people, at helping them flourish. So firstly, Jesus did it, so we should think about it and care about it. Secondly, is that why we should care is that if we flourish in our teams, we'll be doing that for the sake of our communities and for justice. That good teamwork is not about uniformity, it's about unity. And we want to do that really well over the next year, so for God's kingdom and for God's justice. So those are the 2 things that we think actually we want to sit with those. That those are 2 important aspects of why team dynamics matters. And today, my real I suppose one piece of advice or tip for you is that you would get real with the people you're working with today. And getting real isn't about sharing your life story and having a sob over a Skype. Getting real is about just being a bit more honest, perhaps, about who you are and maybe what you struggle with, and maybe some of your experience in the past of working in teams, good and bad. Getting real is really important if we're going to work well together. So that's where we're going to start, but we're going to focus firstly, as I've said, on the 16 personality types. So hopefully you've done that and you've got 4 letters. We're going to go through those a little bit, unpack them a little bit, so don't worry. But the reason we're starting with this is the 16 personalities is about self-awareness, and the key to understanding more of how we work individually will then help us work well in teams. How we understand how we function will help us. Self-awareness is usually pretty much always a good thing. And I also want to say two things. Firstly, difference is good. We don't want a team of people who are all the same necessarily. So we want to say that there's no letter that you will have got that's wrong, or preferred. That's not anything that's true. The second thing I want to say, a little public service announcement, is that these letters that you've been given, the personality type preferences, they're just preferences, they're not boxes. So we're not trying to box you in. This is just a way for you to understand a little bit more, opening up a few parts of yourself to understand how you work. Psalm 139 says, I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and it talks about God knitting us together in our mother's wombs. We are a whole people full of lots of things, full of gifts and strengths and skills and lots of amazing things. And the personality stuff that we've asked you to do isn't about boxing that and just saying this is the only type of person I can ever be. It's just about helping you understand a little bit more of how you work. So the 16 personalities is a version of the Myers Briggs type indicator, and that is loosely based on how, basically understanding how we perceive the world and how do we make decisions. And each letter you've been given of the 4 are all preferences. So if you've got one letter, it doesn't mean that you can't take on attributes and characteristics of the opposing letter. Actually, every person can learn those, and the likelihood is you've been given a percentage for each letter that you've received. And the likelihood is that none of you have got 100% on all letters, because very few people are 100%. It's all a scale. And that means that we can slip and slide along the scale. So I never want you to feel as though you can't take on something of the other preference. It just means that you lean one way more than another. So that's where we've landed. We're going to go through them now, and I'm going to unpack them a little bit, and there will be slides as well as I go that will explain a little, just maybe have a little bit more detail, a little bit of thought. So the first 2 letters are E or I, extrovert or introvert. And this is about asking the question of where do you get your energy from? So extroverts get their energy from people, and introverts get maybe more energy from spending time by themselves. So there are lots of things we could talk about there, but actually in every pairing of letters, I want to just take a moment to debunk some misconceptions that we have. So extroverts are more people focused in terms of their energy, but some misconceptions is that they're obnoxious, that they're needy, that they can never be alone. All of those things aren't true. And whereas for introverts, who get their time and energy from being alone, the misconception is that they're shy, that they're quiet, they're antisocial, they don't like people. Again, that is not true. So those are some things that I'm just going to, every letter and pairing we come to, I'm going to unpack a few of those things. So you should have got an E or an I. The next 2 pairing of letters is S or N, sensing or intuitive. Intuitive is a bit weird, so the N, intuitive. So sensing and intuitive. How do you take in information? Sensing people will take it in through their 5 senses, through facts, whereas intuitives, Ns, will be more about patterns, impressions, possibilities. So those are the 2 different pairings. You will have had one of those letters, S or N. Again, some common misconceptions that we can have of both of them. What I would say is that every person has both the big picture and the details, but in both the S and the N, they have different starting points. So Ns, intuitives, will be a bit more top down. They'll start at the top of the big picture and then work their way down into the detail. Whereas sensors, S's, will be a bit more bottom up. So they'll be thinking more about the detail and then building up a picture. So really, you often end up getting to the same point, but you're starting from a slightly different perspective. So that's all about how you take in information. The next 2 pairings are thinking and feeling, T or F. And this is really linked to how do you make decisions. And I think this is one where we can sometimes stumble into conflict a little bit more. So people who have a thinking preference, or T, are maybe make decisions on facts, whereas feeling preference people are making their decisions more on values or feelings. I think with this one, there are some real misconceptions that we can place over people, and that can be very unhelpful. So for thinkers, a misconception is that they're not sensitive towards others, that they don't really care about emotions of other people. That is absolutely not true. And for feelers, for F preference, there's a misconception that they never think logically, that they only ever feel things. That is just, again, not true. Remember that scale, that T's and F's, they'll just lean one way or another, but it doesn't mean that they don't think or feel. So I want you to know that don't overthink that. Don't be like, oh, I only ever feel things, so I can never think. Oh no, I only ever think and I never feel. That is not true. So that's the next pairing. And then the final two are judging, J, or perceiving, P. And this is linked to how you organise and implement the external world or information internally. So how do you take what's outside of you and internalise it? So those with the judging preference are a little bit more structured and planned, with those with the P perceiving preference are maybe more open with options. So they prefer leaving things a bit more open. I don't think that the J, judging, is necessarily a useful word sometimes, because it implies that people with a J preference are judgmental, and that is not true. People with a J preference as well aren't always super organised and aren't people who make decisions super easily. So that's just a misconception as well, that they're not judgmental. They sometimes are a bit scatty, and it sometimes takes them a while to make decisions. Whereas P preferences, a massive misconception of them is that they're good in crisis, and that they're disorganised, that they're, actually people with a P preference are sometimes very good at making lists, can be very organised, and can really struggle when things shift and change. So that's the J or the P, judging or perceiving. So you should have got 4 letters, an E or an I, an S or an N, a T or an F, and a J or a P. And what I'd like you to do now is we're going to take a moment to pause. We're going to take a 10 minutes. I'd like you to map out the preferences for your whole team. So I'd like it if you could list, kind of get onto the Skype or Zoom that you're about to go on, and I'd like you to all share the letters that you've got. And I'd like to map out the preferences, so just listing them all. And you can do that creatively if you'd like to, if you want to like sketch that out on a piece of paper, or if you want to have a shared document. But the question really is, where are the gaps? So have you got a lot of the same type of person on there? Have you got a lot of Fs and no Ts? Have you got a lot of Js and no Ps? So noticing where the gaps are and where the trends are, and maybe just having a little discussion quickly about what that could mean for your team. If there are gaps in some of these things, what would that mean in how you work together? So this is about recognising how you work and then applying that to your team. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes to do that. Off you go, have a really good chat, and we'll be back soon. Welcome back. I hope you had some good conversations there, and continue to think about that. Continue to think about where your gaps are, what are the trends, and how you can combat some of that together. We're going to move on from some of that self-awareness stuff now to thinking more about generally as a team, how do you work? And I've mentioned already, we're going to be watching a video after I've given a bit of a spiel by a guy called Patrick Lencioni. And he has come up with these 5 dysfunctions that he sees often in teams. Patrick Lencioni is a team management expert. He goes into quite corporate environments and will help them figure out how to work better together. We'll sort through problems, kind of coaching them through that. And the video that you're going to watch is of him at the HGB Leadership Conference in London from a few years ago, where he was asked to speak about these dysfunctions. And we're going to go through just the first 2 because it's a bit of a long video. And I think the first 2, if you start to get those right, that will be a very good foundation for the rest of the year. Patrick is asking really the question of how do we work together best, and what are the pitfalls, what are the dysfunctions that can hold teams back. So we're going to cover the first 2 dysfunctions, and he names them as the lack of trust and a fear of conflict. So if you are writing things down, I would love it if you could write some of this stuff down that I'm about to say. I'm just going to unpack loosely what he means by both of those before we watch the video. So the first dysfunction he talks about is lack of trust. And his main point is really, if there is one person on the team that cannot be vulnerable, it will spread to the rest of the team, meaning no one will be vulnerable. And he highlights that vulnerability needs to be at the core of how we then trust people. So he says that in order to combat this, often the leader of the group, the organisation, the team has to be the one who goes first and has to own up to things they struggle with, to being vulnerable. In the Bible, I think we can often recognise vulnerability as being quite linked to humility. And humility is not self-deprecation. So it's not saying, oh, I'm really bad at that, but it is actually, humility is about knowing your strengths and your weaknesses, knowing the things that you struggle with and the things that you're really excellent at, and being okay with someone seeing both of these. Vulnerability is about owning those two things and showing them to people. And then it is really up to the rest of their team to back each other in that. Knowing that someone else's success is not your failure. Someone else's success is not your failure. So humility is about kind of recognising the strengths and the weaknesses, and vulnerability is about showing those and owning those. So that's the first dysfunction that Patrick will touch on, a lack of trust. The second dysfunction that Patrick Lencioni will unpack a little bit of is fear of conflict. His main point is that conflict is actually really necessary for a thriving team, and it kind of slightly counterintuitively, conflict is a very loving act when it is about stretching ideas and processes. And Patrick Lencioni talks about good teams being those who face conflict head on. Most of us are probably quite afraid of conflict. I certainly am. And we struggle to even engage in it, or we head straight into it without considering the consequences. I think those are often two reactions towards conflict. Patrick Lencioni says that we won't see growth if we don't disagree and wrestle with ideas together. And it's really about stretching ideas as a team, pulling things apart, disagreeing so that the best outcome can be found. And realistically, I think that conflict isn't always done very well in church. It's not modelled super well because we're too polite to talk about things that we disagree on, or we find it easier to leave. And I think that's a massive issue, particularly in the UK church. And wouldn't it be amazing if you guys could start modelling disagreement really well, modelling disagreement around ideas rather than people. And actually, how we relate to conflict is really often related to our personal context, about how we've seen it modelled before. Sometimes we've seen it really modelled quite badly. We've seen conflict be very explosive. Or if you're like me, growing up, I didn't see a lot of conflict. It just wasn't present, which that's in some ways a very nice thing, but it's meant that I find it really difficult to engage in conflict now. So those are two things that he talks about: lack of trust and a fear of conflict. So now, enough of listening to me. You're going to switch over to Patrick Lencioni. You're going to watch the video, and then we'll come back and I'll give you some practical things to focus in on, some questions quickly, and then you'll have some more time to talk as a team. So enjoy watching Patrick Lencioni. He's a fun guy to listen to be honest, and he's a fellow ENFP, so I love it. So I'll see you after that. I hope you really enjoyed watching Patrick Lencioni there. I know you've only covered the first two dysfunctions, so if you would like to watch the rest of the video, it's really good. He goes into the next three, which are all kind of layered on top of each other. So would recommend going back over that. So as I said earlier, we're just going to touch loosely on a few practical things that you can do. I'll give you a few questions, and then actually you're going to spend quite a large chunk of time just talking together in your teams about what this means going forward for you. So the first dysfunction, as we've talked about, is lack of trust, because there's not any vulnerability. And as I've mentioned, Patrick talks about the leader is the one who has to go first to start establishing this culture of trust. Vulnerability needs to be something that's modelled from the leader. How do we grow in vulnerability though? How do we start to do that? If you are someone who's leading this group that you're part of, how do you do this? I think there are three things that I would say about growing trust and vulnerability. The first thing is actually just to continue the conversations you're going to start today. Don't let this conversation that you have be the only thing you kind of talk about the rest of the year. Come back to this. I think it's good to check in on how the team are doing. How do we feel as though we're working together? And that's a bit of a vulnerable moment, isn't it? But learning to trust that you're all working together. So firstly, continue the conversation. Secondly, in how we grow in vulnerability, I think getting curious about people. I think curiosity breeds vulnerability in such a fascinating way. When we open up people by asking really open-ended, excellent questions, like, what are you struggling with at the moment? Or if you don't mind me asking, how are you finding prayer at the moment? What is God doing in your life? What have you been really excellent at recently? Asking really good open-ended questions will help enable someone else to be vulnerable, and you can then model that back. And then the third thing is prayer. When we pray together in teams, that can do wonders. God will move through that. And we can be a bit more open perhaps sometimes when we're praying for each other about how we really are. Vulnerability is not feelingsy though, it's not emotional. It doesn't have to be always telling your life story and sobbing away through a meeting. I think vulnerability is actually a very brave and courageous act. It's something that we're not very good at doing, perhaps. And because Patrick talks about the leader going first, I thought that I should be the one to go first for you, because I'm leading this session apparently. So I would say that I really struggle with vulnerability and have done for quite a long time. And growing up, I was often seen as quite a dependable person, quite a strong person perhaps, and I thought that being a Christian was about holding it all together, and I thought that in order to be a good witness I couldn't show any of my weaknesses, and I really let pride get in the way of that, and I suppose to a certain extent that was okay. But when I started to hit a few bumps in the road, all of that started to slightly fall apart. And all of a sudden my lack of vulnerability really trapped me. And particularly that is linked to when I was in my second year of university. And I just went through a year where I felt as though things were really falling apart. And I was very depressed. I was very anxious about my life. And I felt as though I didn't really know who God was. I didn't really understand what my life was, and it felt really, really isolating. And I would go home every day and cry in my room by myself, and I didn't let anyone in on that process. I didn't know how to be vulnerable. I didn't know how to show my weakness. So from the outside, I probably looked very strong, because I could keep up a facade, but internally I was all over the place. And I remember I did about 6 or 7 months of this while I was at university, and it got to a point in kind of April, Easter of that year, where I thought I can't go on like this. I need to talk about how I'm feeling with someone. I don't know who, but someone. And one of my friends had been a bit open with me previously about some of the stuff she struggled with. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna go around and just talk to her. So I called her up and I said, can I come over? And she was like, okay, I'm packing up my house, just so you know. And I thought, okay. So I went round to her house, and she was in the middle of packing up boxes because she was literally moving house. And she said, you know, you're all right. I feel like, what's going on? And just being asked that question, I just was inconsolable. I kind of started floods of tears, and all of a sudden all the weakness that I'd been hiding just came out of me, and all the pain and the suffering that I'd been trying to shelter people from was revealed. And it was quite funny because I was crying and she kind of packed up the box in the corner, just kind of listening in as I kind of just wept. But that was a bit of a turning point for me in the friendship I had with that person, because it meant that I was vulnerable. I showed her the weak side of myself. She'd seen some of that strength, but she'd never seen those weaknesses. And it meant that we've become really, really close friends now. She's one of my closest friends. And we've both been much better at being real, at getting real with each other, at showing the good and the bad. And that was a powerful story in my life, but I wonder if that's ever happened to you, or if someone's ever done that to you as well. So that's my little story, and I'd like it now if you could reflect for you personally about how easy you're open, how easy you find it to be open or honest about your weaknesses. So I'd like it if you could write down, out of a number from 1 to 10, 10 being you find it so easy to be vulnerable, you find it really easy to own your mistakes, own your weaknesses, own your strengths, you've got it. 1 being, frankly the opposite, that you've never really talked about any of this with anyone. So how do you find being open and honest? How easy do you find that out of 1 to 10? I'd like you to write down that number. So you've got a little bit of time to do that. Just think through what that would look like for you. Great. We'll move on, we'll come back to that number, but we'll move on to the fear of conflict, the second dysfunction that Patrick Lencioni talks about. And I think what's interesting about what he says is that he does talk a lot about the context of our relationships that we've grown up with, or our relationships with spouses or with friends, about how that then helps us process how we deal with conflict. So perhaps really a question that you should be thinking about is how have my family dealt with conflict over the years? How have I seen it modelled from a young age? Did I see it modelled? Was it done well? Was it not done well? And you don't have to share that with anyone, so don't worry, but I suppose a bit of my story and some of that is that my parents didn't really argue growing up, which was obviously a massive blessing, but I never really saw it much. I didn't really see conflict happen. So therefore it's really shaped how I do conflict now, that I avoid it quite a lot. But if we look at who Jesus is, I think Jesus was someone who disagreed very well and managed conflict extremely well. He wasn't someone who shied away from conflict. He actually would often go in and ask really excellent questions. He wasn't conflict averse. And so I think sometimes we can think that conflict isn't a very Christian thing to do, whereas when we look at who Jesus is and how he wrestled with questions that people had for him, where he wrestled with people who really disagreed with what he was saying, he did so very graciously, and he always put the person looked at the person in front of him and tried to help them understand what he was trying to say better, but not in a patronising way. But I do think that when we're doing conflict, if we're going to do it well, a big part of that is learning to own our own apologies towards people, and learning to say sorry for when we think we've overstepped the mark, and then also learning to forgive people when they do say sorry. I think conflict and forgiveness do need to go hand in hand, because we won't always get it right. Disagreement might sometimes not go as well as we planned, but we need to learn to say sorry and learn to forgive, and realise that the person in front of you, the individual, is not just an opinion, but is a child of God, and view them that way. A big part of how we do conflict well is to avoid gossip. So if conflict's happening within your team, which it would be great if it did, because disagreement around ideas stretches us and leads to really cool things, we want to avoid gossip. We want the conflict to remain in that committee meeting. We don't want it to bleed out into other parts of our lives. And if you do need to have a conversation with someone, make it much more intentional. Don't whisper and allow rumour to take over. So that's a few thoughts about conflict. We're now going to do a similar exercise about kind of thinking about numbers and how well you think you handle conflict. So again, from 1 to 10, I'd like to write down a number of how well you think you handle conflict. And maybe that is related to how your family has done it in the past. So 10 being that you handle conflict really well, that you're excellent at disagreeing and it kind of not really affecting you. You're really good at handling it, you're excellent at working through and being very emotionally mature in it. 1 being that even the word conflict makes you freak out, or you've never even had a disagreement with anyone. So from 1 to 10, rate how well you think you handle conflict. Amazing. So you've got 2 numbers in front of you. 1 related to trust and 1 related to conflict. I would like it if, with the first number, about how easy you find it to be open and honest business, if you could tell, you're going to go into a sort of time of discussion now, and I'd like you to tell your group what your number is. And you don't have to go into loads of detail, but just, I suppose, you know, if you've got a certain number, it'd be good to just give a little bit of an explanation about why it is that number. And every person on the team needs to share something briefly. This is about being open and honest and communicating just briefly how easy you find it to be open about your weaknesses. And I'm going to suggest that because Patrick talks about the leader going first, that if you are the president or co-president or vice president of the group, that you guys should go first on that you guys should share. Of course, don't feel that you have to overshare, but I do think this is an opportunity that will set you up for the rest of the year really well. If you're just able to be open about the number that you have and how easy you find that. Personally, I find it really hard, so it's okay if you do find it difficult. And I'm not trying to convince you to be at number 10 by the end of today. That's not what we're trying to do. This is about everyone on the team being aware of how easy everyone else finds it to be open. The second number is related to the conflict. So once you've had a discussion about trust and vulnerability and how easy you find it to be vulnerable, the second number related to conflict, I'd like you to tell the group what number you are. And I suppose the question I'd like you to think about is, what do you need to be aware of about disagreement or conflict as a team? Perhaps that is related to the fact that maybe there's a whole bunch of people who are very on like 2s or 3s when it comes to conflict, and then there's half the team are about 7 or 8s. If that is the case, what do you need to be aware of? How do you reconcile those 2 things? So that's the first question. The second question is, what can you put in place to have healthy conflict? So once you're a bit aware of the lay of the land, what can you put in place that will enable conflict to happen really well? So it might be that you set up debates on committee meetings, and where you come prepared to debate an idea. And we do it as a Just Love staff team every now and then. When we're trying to sort of wrestle with a theme or an idea or a topic, we sometimes come willing to debate with 2 people having prepped opposite sides of an argument. Or it could be that you set up some sort of signal that you would use in a meeting that would just be about you disagreeing with an idea. So there was one group that used to do brutal acts, or there's sometimes groups that will do certain other things with their hands, or raising their hand when they disagree. And that is something that is kind of good because it slightly detaches disagreement from being personal. And we always want disagreement to be very like around ideas. We don't want it to be very personal. So that's the second question. So the second question is, what can you put in place? There will be a slide with all this information on once I've finished. But the more real you are now, the better you will be at working together. So that is what I want you to go with. I want you to encourage you to be real. When we get real, things can change and shift. And ultimately, all of this stuff I've talked about, dysfunctions of team, personality types, all of this is for God's kingdom. When we are working better as a team, we will see justice in our world. As I said earlier, God doesn't want uniformity, but he does long for unity. So go away, do the exercises, have some discussion, chat, and come up with a few things you will do going forward, a few things that you are going to write down about how you are going to move forward on trust and conflict. So as we draw everything to a close, I'd love to pray for you in your discussions. Father, thank you for the fact that we can look at Jesus and understand more of what it means to be part of a team. Thank you that we are part of your team. And I pray that these guys, as they have discussions about their overall team and how they all function, that you would bless them in that and bless them with really excellent discussion. Amen. Have a really good time, guys. I'll see you later.